The technique I'm going to be showing right now is useful for a lot of different areas in Vue. Um, Basically, what we're going to be doing is creating kind of pseudo objects to make an ecosystem. So instead of using the vegetation species, we're going to be using rock objects. And what we're going to do is use the material to make it look like trees and be able to customize it in a couple of different ways. This is a really good method for previs or fast motion shots and also distant forest ecosystems. So the terrain I currently have picked out for this, if you take a look at a render of it, what I'm going to be doing is adding the ecosystem to this terrain, mostly on where the grass areas are showing up. And the rock objects, by default, are not going to work perfectly, so we will have to make a few modifications. And there's a couple of different things we can do with it. Let's go ahead and start out by adding the ecosystem layers. And just starting with the first layer, we're going to have a couple of different ones to represent different types of trees. So we're going to edit the material. And if you want to load this scene in, it is pseudo forest. And the terrain is a procedural terrain. The current material is a layered material. So we've got 4 different layers, each using different environment, mainly to control the distribution. With some of the layers, we have connections to the terrain itself and the altitude output. So we're going to start by going to the top layer, and what we can do is select ecosystem. And we do have to make sure that we're not changing the material scale. There's one thing with ecosystems that what can happen is, depending on the scale that is used for the ecosystem layer, it will actually manipulate all of the other layers underneath it. So I just want to make sure that setting it to 5 hasn't actually changed or multiplied the scales by 5 or divided. There's a few things that can happen with these layers. So I'm just going to go ahead and double check and make sure that this material scale is going to stay the same. And what I want to do is just make another render and compare it to the last render. So I just have Photoshop open now with both of the renders. The one with the added ecosystem layer with nothing on it, and then the original. So this is the original render, and if we take a look, switching over to the new render with the ecosystem layer, you can see a huge change between the material scale. So basically everything has been increased in size. So what we need to do is go back and just make sure that we're changing the scale of the ecosystem. I'm going to go ahead and change that to a scale of 1. And I'm going to just verify and go ahead and render that out again. I am using the final render mode. Sometimes it's best not to use the preview for this because some of the finer details may not be able to be seen in the preview mode, so it might be hard to tell whether or not the scale is correct. So I've set the scale to 1, and it looks like it's going to match up, but I'll go ahead and let this finish up and we can take a look at the comparison. So now just back in Photoshop again, taking a look at the original render, and then after adding the ecosystem and changing the scale. So setting it to 1 allowed us to keep everything the way we originally wanted it. Really depending on the mapping modes used. So taking a look at the mapping mode for each material, sometimes a value of 1 for the scale isn't going to work. So it really is kind of dependent on the mapping modes you're using for each individual layer. So it's just a good idea to double check and make sure that that's all working correctly. The scale itself of the ecosystem layer doesn't matter. manipulating the scale of the ecosystem layer will not affect the ecosystem. In some cases, it can change the altitude range and the way that's set up, but other than that, it's really only going to change your materials underneath it. Now, I am going to end up using dynamic population in the end, but while I'm working, I like to be able to just hit populate because it's a lot quicker than selecting render to update the ecosystem. And because of that, I don't want to populate this entire terrain. It's actually quite large. I didn't reduce it, and if we take a look at where the camera is in relation to what's actually showing in the scene, there's a lot of available space for the ecosystem. So I don't want all of the other areas to be populated. And there's a little technique you can do just to stay within the camera range, which is pretty nice. What I'm going to do is go over to the variable density of the ecosystem layer, check that on, and go to Edit Function. And what I'm going to use is camera mapping just to stay within the range. So it's kind of a dynamic standard population. So it's dynamic in the sense that it's going to populate where the camera's at, but we do still have to hit populate in order to populate the terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the texture map node, change the UV coordinate, up at the top the input node over to camera projection, and choose our main camera. Aspect ratio, I'm using 16:9. It doesn't need to be exact. We should be able to get 1.777. Should be about what we need. Might have to double check that. I'm going to select the texture map and change the tiling modes to none on the X and the Y, and then invert. And we don't even need an image for this. Connect the grayscale output to the density output. So the grayscale output of the texture map to the density. So now, basically anything we have in the ecosystem is only going to populate within the camera extent. This does have a reverse function. So if you're looking dead on at a terrain and the camera's more level, it will populate behind the camera, kind of mirroring the effect. Since we're looking down at the terrain, there's nothing behind us. We don't have to worry about that area being populated. At least we shouldn't. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the material, and what we're going to do is now add in the rock object. Now we have a choice to be able to create the color variations automatically. When it says that these variations cannot be removed, they really mean it. Once we set this rock object, change its material, we are no longer going to be able to use the rock objects for creating rocks or typical purposes you would use it for, because the material will apply to any single layer that has the rock on it. So if you need to bake the object and set it up separately, that may be something you want to do, depending on the scene. Now, every ecosystem layer has the ability to manipulate the color and set up an overall color change. So whether or not you could just check no or select no for no color variation and then just control that manually. The scenes I set up, I was using the color variation, so I'm just going to continue to do that. It's going to be harder to control for the color, so typically I would suggest not using a color variation and then adjusting the variable color manually with function. Now, I have no idea what size this is going to be, so I'm going to start with a very high scale, starting with 50, selecting populate, and this way we can start stepping it down instead of starting with something really, really small and potentially overloading the scene. We're going to start with something a little bit higher. That's just because my scales I have set up right now are not exactly realistic. So This way I can just start with something a little higher and then really kind of fine-tune it. So I'm probably going to bring the scale down to about 4. And it's going to take a while to populate. We just got to pay attention to the overall amount of instances. Either way, we're still going to end up with a lot less polygons in the scene and memory usage than if we were using trees. So just to show you how that camera function and density for the texture map is working, we now have basically a manual dynamic population. We're setting exactly where the population is going to be in front of the camera, which is pretty nice. And that's rather useful for any sort of setup when you're first getting started with an ecosystem. Just being able to do that and reduce your range, especially when you have such a large terrain. You still want to use the populate button, because it does have its advantages. In the end, we, of course, are going to be switching over to dynamic population, but while I'm working on the scene, it's just much easier to hit populate than continually render, which could cause memory problems and loads of other things. So I think I will actually bring this up a little bit larger, bring it to a scale of 5. We can always bring it down later. This is just kind of a planning stage. I'm going to go over to the Environment tab now, and first thing I'm going to do is remove any of the fuzziness options that are pre-set up, and then adjust the slope range. And I don't want to have the steeper slopes being populated. We could duplicate some of the settings from the grass if we want an exact match, but I really just want to reduce some of the overall amounts. Because I am intending to increase the density of the overall layer, and that way we can really fill in a lot of these different parts of the scene. I am going to be turning off the decay near foreign objects. I don't really have any objects in the scene that would decay it, but still, it takes one less thing out of the calculation. Now I also want to set up a little bit of an offset. I'm going to choose the absolute offset from surface and drive it with a function. Really don't need anything special for this. I'm just going to add in a noise node, connect the offset to the noise, increase the scale. We could add a turbulence node to that as well. First we'll just take a look and see how this is going to turn out. Because the output range of this is really between 1 and -1, and since we're dealing with values that are equal to about meters, we do need to increase the overall output. So I'm going to add in a filter, use the map node, clip the outer range values, and set the upper to, let's go ahead and use 10. I'll have to double check my internal unit to see what values I'm going to need. And I am working with 0.1, so 10 is actually going to be, I believe, 100. So I'm going to go ahead and start small, just using 7 and 1. 1 for the lower value, 7 for the upper, so that -1 is equal to 1, and 1 is equal to 7. And then clipping out everything out of bounds. We'll have to see how this is going to turn out. And it looks like that's not quite enough. If we wanted to, we could disconnect the parameter and set the value in the interface first, in the material editor, and then when we extract it, the number that is set will show up as a constant node. So if I disconnect this, we can raise it. Let's go ahead and try something a little higher. And it looks like around 6 should be the most we would want to go. So now if I extract this, it's going to give me the number I need, which is 122. So I am going to have to set that up again, because it did delete everything once I disconnected it. So we're going to set up another filter, map, And we're going to use that upper value of 122, clip the outer range values, and set the minimum amount to, let's say, 3. The numbers did change a bit in Vue 8 from Vue 7, so some of the values may not work exactly the same through some of the numerics when representing meters, but it's really dependent. The material's always been kind of different. So now we have another node set up. Might need to change the scale of the noise to get it to look a little bit better, have a little more variation. So what I want to do is extract the origin, and then select the constant vector that's created, and turn, or replace by turbulence. We could just use a simple turbulence, just kind of adjusting largest feature and amplitude. We don't really need anything special for that. So now we have a lot more variation all around. I'm probably going to end up reducing and kind of clipping out some of the lower ranges and the lower altitude. But first I want to go ahead and save this out as it currently is. So what I'm going to do is clear the ecosystem, because that's going to really increase the file size. So since we're just populating it from a function, we could just repopulate when we load the scene back in. So I'm just going to go ahead and save out another version of this. So I'm going to go back into the material and just take the altitude range from the bottom. I'm just going to pull that up a bit so then when we populate, we shouldn't have as much showing near the bottom. And we can see where that's starting to clip out besides the slope areas. And we now need to make a couple modifications to the rock object. So if we go over to the Library tab, we can select Ecosystem Rock. And if there's no population, you won't be able to select this object. So you will need to make sure that there are some rocks populated. And what I want to do is edit selected master object. It's going to pull up the polygon mesh options. I'm going to turn off double-sided and increase the smoothing mesh to 180 degrees. I'm also going to turn on dynamic subdivision. Whether or not this is really working as an ecosystem, not entirely certain, but I have noticed in some cases it does help improve the lighting. So we can click OK, and it's just going to update that object as part of the ecosystem. The rock object is very jagged, so it's really important that we smooth out the mesh in order to correct shadows, especially with ray tracing. I've got the scene set up for shadow maps right now, so it does look a little bit better. In the ray tracing modes, you will have to enable, or you may need to enable some sort of softness to round those out. Or you can, with the dynamic subdivision on, bake the object loading in a rock, and then that'll give you a higher detailed mesh. So now we should have the ecosystem material showing, but it's currently not showing up in the material tab. So I'm going to go ahead and just repopulate the layer, and hopefully the material will show up. And here we go. So now we have the material, and what we can do is load in any of the presets. I've already created one called Pseudo Tree. So what we can do is just load that in. Now, it may not update the OpenGL, because typically when you load materials in through the Materials tab, it doesn't update the OpenGL. But that's alright, because the OpenGL really isn't helping us right now very much. If we go into the material, actually what I'm going to do to save on video memory is just change this over to Billboard. before I end up running into any problems. Right now it's still running pretty smoothly, but it will eventually hog a lot of memory. So I'm going to make some changes to the scaling, going to scaling orientation, just turning down uniform a little bit, setting it about 70%, and changing the size variation to 1.5 on the X and the Y. And I'm also going to take the direction from surface and move it all the way to vertical. Now I want to show you some of the changes I made to the rock material and kind of what makes up this current material. I have one-sided turned on, and in the Effects tab I'm using the backlight, which is used for the leaves of trees, and it allows the light to shine through, and it manipulates the way the shadows work. It basically just causes kind of a glow behind the object, sort of a false translucency. I'm also using a bit of a lighting change. So what I'm using to control the bump, I'm also using to control the diffusion. This will allow me to darken areas within ambient and shadowed areas. And overall, it's going to look a lot better. Same thing with the rest of the materials. The rock surface has a very important diffusion function tied to it in order to allow it to look correct under ambient lighting. Another trick you can do is if you connect the bump to the ambient output. So if you add an output node, use ambient, that works really well, connecting it to the bump so that when you hit an ambient lit area, you don't lose all the detail of the material. So that's one of the main important things. The scale of rocks is quite different than other objects. Right now, the scale is set to 40 because I originally designed it with an internal unit of 1 rather than 0.1, which is what I'm working with. So that does change all material scales. I will have to just check and make sure that the material scale is set correctly. Other than that, I've got a depth of 4 on the bump and just a little bit of color variation. I am using, for the main shape, a distributed pattern round samples, and then some of the different settings for that. So you can go ahead and load in that material, take a look at it. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render of how it currently looks. And we may need to make some changes to the ecosystem color. Let's just see how it's turning out at the moment. And it does look like I am going to need to decrease the scale of the material. I'm probably going to cut it in half to start with and see. Also, some of these objects, with the directions they're facing, some of the scales, I'm probably going to end up manipulating that a little bit more, maybe squishing them down, changing the Z overall scale, because it is a little choppy. It looks okay towards the back. I'm going to go back and edit the material and just bring that down to a scale of 20. Click OK, and now what it needs to do is just update the material. So just let it finish out. It'll usually go to a value of about 25% and then update, at least in the 64-bit version. So you don't actually have to wait for it to go all the way across. Usually stops around 25% and then updates the ecosystem. So I'm also going to go into the procedural terrain and edit the ecosystem. I'll go ahead and rename this tree layer 1, so that's not called the layer that's underneath it, where we created the ecosystem from. Selecting the layer, select ecosystem, it'll duplicate, create a layer, same name as the layer below it. Also carries over all the environment settings. So I am going to adjust the color. Right now it's setting the overall color to black. And although it doesn't look too bad that way. I might need to update that, and that's because it usually takes the color from the ecosystem, but the way I manipulated the material kind of prevented that from happening. So first I'm going to go to Scaling and Orientation, take the maximum size variation for Z, and change that to, let's say, 0.3. And then I am going to take the direction from surface and just move it to 3% from vertical to perpendicular. And then reduce the rotation to round about 45 degrees. And take the overall scaling and bring it down to 0.85. Populate that. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on variable color and change the color map. So we can edit the color map, change the color, and I have some different colors already loaded in. So let's go ahead and do 59 for the red, 64 for green, 45 for blue for the RGB values, and it should update the overall color, hopefully. If not, it should end up working anyway. So now we have actually a really intense green that you can see showing. So it does look like there's a little bit of a color change. So I'm going to turn off the variable color. Looks like we're going to have to leave it at black. But it does look like it's rendering correctly, so that should be okay. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the camera and just move out a little, and then position the camera looking downward more, and that way we can reduce the amount of objects we have, and I do want to end up decreasing the scale a little bit further. So we're going to go to Scale, set it to 3, we can repopulate, and it should render correctly with that density setting for the projection. If you end up switching cameras, you will need to update that density function and change the projection camera if you change cameras. And you still want to project in the same area. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render of this. And overall, I don't think that looks too bad. It'll definitely work for a distant ecosystem, or previs, or like I said, fast motion animation, where you're really flying over the terrain very quickly and you really won't see the details. Really reduces the amount of resources needed to render the scene. And it can also help prevent some of the flickering problems due to ecosystems. And really, it's just going to be a matter of tweaking the material scale. So what I'm going to do now is add another layer and create another type of tree. Create more of a conifer. So we can edit the material. We're going to go back to that rock, select ecosystem, and then we can move that up. Change the scale to 1, and that way we're not manipulating all the scales of the material underneath it. And let's call it, or select the name, and we'll call it conifer layer. So now we do need to set up some of these different functions again, turning off the decayed or foreign objects, adjusting the environment, turning off all the fuzziness options. What I'm going to do for the slope range this time is reduce it on the top and the bottom. And that way we have a nice variation between the current setting. And I do need to take a look at the scaling and just make sure that they're somewhat similar. Mainly the main scale. So what I need to do is add in a rock. Now right when I add in a rock, it's going to add exactly the same rock as the previous layer, because we've already defined that rock in the first material. And anytime we use the rock object again, it is going to be based on the same material carried over, and the manipulation we have is the variable color. And in this layer, the variable color is showing from the original material color. So really, we need to update that object. You might be able to do what we did before, is go into the Library tab. After editing it, really depending on how you deselect it, click from the panels, potential for updating it. But let's go over to the scaling and orientation. Actually, first general, set the scale to be just about the same to start with. And then make it non-uniform. And then the maximum size variation, I'm going to set to 0.2 for the X and Y and 10 on the Z. Reduce the density amount. And not really going to adjust the offset. Turn off dynamic population. And I do also want that density function, so we can go ahead and just set it up again. Or you can copy and paste it over, but it might not carry over the correct projector. And setting this up is really rather quick. So setting the repeat modes to none, selecting the camera projection, projector main camera, connect density to the grayscale output, and now we can populate the new layer. In the last scene I worked on with this, it did not restore the original material for the rock. And after going to the materials, I can see the chipped rock surface has returned, and it's now part of the second rock layer. So this does give us the ability to change and create a separate material. But like I said, last time I did this, it didn't work, and it wasn't available, and just kind of overwrote. So it may not be the most reliable, so don't depend on it. I'm going to go back to the scaling and orientation and adjust the direction from surface, reduce the up axis only, and then I am going to go ahead and increase that Z scale to 10 or 15 up from 10 and see if we can get something a little bit taller. Also increase the scale to 4 and make it a little bit larger. Might need to reduce the overall density, but just want more of a spiky type rock showing for the conifers. And what I'm going to do is modify that material. So first, before I load in the same material, I am going to edit the current first layer material and change the names. This way, when I reload, it should keep those materials separate. So now I'm going to go to the chipped surface, load a material, and just reload that pseudo tree material. We'll need to edit the scale. And let's go ahead and bring it down to 10. And since we do have, in this case, an additional material available, we don't need to make this modification within the ecosystem. And what I want to do is just darken it, because the conifers are going to be much darker than the other trees. So we don't want them to be glowing as brightly as the broadleaves. And anytime we make any changes to the materials, it's usually a good idea to populate once again, just because it's not necessarily going to update the material always. It should, but it doesn't mean it's going to. So we can go ahead and repopulate both layers. And then I'm going to go ahead and save this out, which means I do have to clear it out before I save it. So let's just go ahead and render it first. Okay, I can tell that most of the conifers are under the terrain. So what I'm going to need to do is set up an offset and end up reducing that Z scale because it is scaling from the pivot point, which is currently on the surface of the terrain. So by reducing the scale and then increasing the offset, we can make sure that they're all jutting up correctly. The color looks like it might be a little red, so I might have to change the overall color within the ecosystem. What I'm going to do is go ahead and take a look at the overall color. So we can see the overall color is set correctly. Variable color is still showing as this redder material. And sometimes that does still affect the ecosystem, even though you haven't actually turned on the variable color. So we're going to see how that works out. If I need to, maybe select one of the lighter green colors so that it's not entirely black. We'll just have to render it out and really see. First I'm going to go ahead and clear out these layers so that I can save another version of the file that isn't huge. So I've just repopulated it and I'm rendering out. We can clearly see one of the major problems with the color variation for the rocks, and that is we have some very red color showing on the conifers. So in this case, what I'm going to need to do is turn off the variable color for that layer, reset the overall color, and if I need to just get a new rock material that doesn't have color variation, what I can do is save out the functions controlling this and jot down the environment settings and density settings, because that rock surface is now loaded into the memory as part of the scene. So we may not be able to get the choice to select no color variation. So what we might have to do is go back to the file before we started the ecosystem and just kind of copy settings over. But what I want to do is just first just bring the color back to where it was. Should fix that. But I'm going to change the scaling and orientation. I'm going to reduce the Z down to 8, and then under density, change the proportional to the size of the instance, and I should be able to raise up those objects above the surface so that most of them are not sticking underground. And we can repopulate that. And that is starting to look a little bit better. I think what I'm going to do is go over to the material, one where we changed the color for the conifer, and reset the overall color. That should hopefully help adjust the color variation on that part of the ecosystem, because that way we don't have all of these conflicting overall color changes, because it doesn't just change the color. It multiplies, subtracts, and does various things to the color, and can be difficult to control when you have a color variation or any sort of variation, whether it's the automated color variation from the rocks or just part of the material itself. So we'll go back to the terrain, repopulate that. It should look a little bit better. Actually, I'm going to bring this down in scale. I think it's a little too large for the moment. So I'm going to scale down to 3, and then I'm going to reduce, or actually increase that Z up to 10, just the uniformity of it. Maybe add 1% direction from surface, a little more rotation, and it does still need a slight change in color variation, maybe a reduction in the material scale. It's basically all tweaking material sizes and kind of adjusting some of the scales here and there to finish this up. But it gives you a really good idea of how you can use these low-res objects in order to create something that looks realistic, depending on the situation and how you're using it. So I'm going to go ahead and make a few more changes, and then we can take a look at some other areas of the scene. So after a few tweaks here and there on the materials, changing some of the ecosystem colors a little, I also changed the camera, lowered the sun a little bit. You can see what will work pretty well for a distant ecosystem or something you're going to see briefly if you're going to be flying over it. With the motion blur and texture filtering, you wouldn't really see much from a normal ecosystem using the vegetation object. So this works quite well for that. Since wind isn't always very noticeable in the breeze settings, you don't really need to worry about not having those available. And if you did need to use these objects further, being able to render a little closer with some better quality, you could basically just map a texture map to the rock object of leaves or tree. Just get a seamless texture of leaves that you could use, or you could even use some of the Vue leaves from some of the vegetation species and apply those to the material. If you need to be able to see the leaves when you get a little closer. But from farther away or something large amount of motion, this does work pretty well. Might need to make some changes to setting up a variable highlight for the material. For that, what you can do, I can close this out. If you go to, let's go ahead and grab one of these materials here and edit. Under highlights, you could just check on the variable highlight, and then using the same thing that controls the density, or really use anything you want. You could even use, in this case, the texture map of the leaves just to control the variable highlight, so that shows up. And that way you don't have these very large glows around the object, although for most animation that's really going to work out pretty well. And here is a closer up render. And as you can see, some of the conifer layer rocks are going above the surface, so I will need to lower or increase the sampling quality in order to get those to connect to the terrain again. But for the most part, even coming close to these objects, in an animation, this one should work out pretty well. Overall, shouldn't really need any texture maps because the bump map will cut away from a lot of that, along with the way the diffusion is set up. So it should work out pretty well. The lighting is going to change if you switch over to ray tracing from shadow maps, and shadow maps kind of have some problems with animation. So depending on how you set it up, so you might need to make a couple modifications or set up multiple directional ray trace lights from slightly different angles, just 1 degree off, to kind of correct that. Another thing you can do is there are a lot of really low resolution species available, and adding an additional ecosystem layer, I'm just going to show you in this layer. The first row, as I had mentioned earlier in the training, these are really low resolution objects. So if you wanted to add in, let's say, a large dead tree, just have some leafless trees in there, this is a really, really low polygon object. So you can take a couple of these and just turn the density down, but just to add a little bit more to the ecosystem, but still have a very lightweight rendering scene. It's going to work out. So you can mix some of those in there as well. And then if you wanted to have some specific areas to cut out, you can use some of the other techniques in the training to set up your level of detail areas to cut out anywhere you're going to be zooming in where you want to have higher quality objects. And all of the scene files, materials are all available with the training, so you can go ahead and load the scene files in, take a look at the materials, and see what you can come up with.